All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling something that I think a lot of you out there have probably struggled with, and that's understanding humor in another language.
Yeah, it's way more than just knowing the words, right?
It really is, and we've got some sources here that are going to help us kind of dig into this. We're going to be a deep dive today into why getting the joke in another language, it's like this whole secret level of fluency.
Totally. And I think for everyone listening, this isn't just about, being polite and chuckling along.
Yeah.
This is about really understanding how another culture thinks and connects. It's like getting beneath the surface.
Yeah, so much deeper than just, the dictionary definition. Okay, so let's unpack this a little bit because, what we find funny, it's so tied to our background, right?
Yeah.
Like something that makes one group just die laughing could totally confuse another group or even offend them, right? And that's because, different societies have such different views on certain topics, like what's okay to joke about, what's not okay to joke about. Think about how different families even view things that are okay to make light of.
Yeah, and I think what's fascinating is how these underlying cultural norms, like you're saying, really shape what's considered fair game for humor, right? Like if you think about, let's say, taboos, for instance.
Yeah.
What's off limits in terms of religion or politics? Like that can change so much from one place to another.
Yeah.
And it's not just about the topic itself, it's how it's approached, right?
Yeah.
Like in the West, you might see satire just going straight at those subjects, no holds barred. But in some Eastern cultures, the approach to humor might be way more indirect. Maybe they'd focus on wordplay or something like that.
Yeah.
And even within the West, you see all these variations, right?
Totally.
Like think about British humor. It's so sharp and ironic. It's a whole different flavor.
And one thing that the sources kind of brought up that was really interesting was this whole idea of, in more individualistic cultures, humor is often seen as this positive thing. It's like it helps you relieve stress, right? You're supposed to laugh, it's good. But historically, in some collectivistic cultures, they've actually viewed humor with more, caution. It's almost seen as a distraction from more serious matters. So it's just so interesting how these different values are even assigned to humor.
It is. And, that kind of leads us to the more linguistic side of things, right?
Yeah.
Because you think about puns and wordplay, they're so tough to translate.
Totally.
Because so much of that humor hinges on the specific sounds and meanings of those words, and those just don't transfer easily across languages.
Like how many English puns are based on words that sound similar but have totally different meanings, right?
Exactly.
And then a translator's got to figure out how to make that work in another language.
And oftentimes they have to completely reinvent the joke.
Right.
Right, to kind of land the same punch.
Yeah.
Like Japanese, for example, has this thing called dojere, which often plays on these similar sounding words. It's a different mechanism than a lot of English puns use.
Wow. And then, throw in idioms and slang. Forget about it because their whole meaning is non-literal, right?
Right.
Which is kind of where the humor comes from, but also makes them super tricky for language learners.
Totally.
Can you imagine trying to explain a phrase like pulling someone's leg to someone who doesn't understand that it's not literal?
That's a good point. And I think what this all points to is how important it is to immerse yourself in the language, interact with native speakers, and even look at resources specifically for idioms. Pay attention not just to what's being said, but how it's being said. The tone of voice, the facial expressions, all of that.
Yeah, so important. And that's something I was just going to touch on, because beyond the words themselves, right? There's this whole other layer of nonverbal cues that contribute to humor.
For sure.
Like your body language, your facial expressions, the tone of your voice. They're so key, especially for understanding things like sarcasm.
Oh, absolutely. It's like a slight eye roll can communicate so much.
Totally.
But here's the thing, and it's a big one. Those nonverbal signals aren't universal.
Right.
A gesture that gets a laugh in one culture could be considered super rude in another.
Yeah.
Just think about the different ways people use hand gestures or make eye contact across cultures. It's wild.
Yeah.
It all feeds into how humor is perceived and expressed.
So when we start to actually look at the different styles of humor globally, things get even more interesting, right?
Right.
Sarcasm. It's so common in Western cultures, but it might not be well received in cultures that value being more direct.
Right.
Puns, as we said, they're just so language dependent. And even self-deprecating humor can be different. Like the way Brits do it is totally different from how Germans might approach it, for example.
Yeah, and I think that's where misunderstandings can happen so easily.
Oh, absolutely.
Like that dry British wit. It might be taken literally in other places.
Yeah.
Or the dark humor you see in some cultures, that might seem jarring to people from more optimistic backgrounds.
Right.
And there's a pattern that keeps popping up, right? It seems like cultures that really emphasize the individual, they tend towards humor that's more direct, even aggressive sometimes, while cultures that prioritize harmony within the group, they often lean toward humor that's more inclusive, maybe self-enhancing.
So, like, if you are trying to navigate all of this, what are some, like, concrete steps that people listening can take?
Well, first and foremost, pay attention,
Right.
be observant. Watch how native speakers react to humor. See what gets a laugh, what doesn't.
Yeah.
And don't be afraid to ask for an explanation. Like if you don't get a joke, just say, hey, I'm still learning about humor in this culture. Could you explain that to me?
It shows you're engaged and willing to learn.
And then immerse yourself, in all sorts of humorous content.
Yeah.
Movies, TV shows, stand-up comedy, even memes and stuff online.
Yeah.
Start with things that are more visual, like slapstick comedy, and gradually work your way up to more language-based humor.
Yeah.
And cultural references, man, those are huge. The more you understand the culture, the funnier the jokes will be.
Yeah, so it's almost like you're actively studying comedy.
Right.
Like, watch shows with subtitles, then try watching them without subtitles. Analyze how the jokes are constructed, Pay attention to the wordplay, to the nonverbal cues.
Totally.
And if there's a reference you don't get, look it up. Google it. Think about who the intended audience is.
Yeah. And remember, be mindful of those cultural sensitivities. What might be hilarious in one context could be totally inappropriate in another.
Right.
But the cool thing is there are so many resources out there now. Language learning platforms sometimes even include notes on humor.
Oh.
And watching comedians who perform in another language, like, Gad Elmaleh in French or something, can be a great way to learn. Just see what makes the audience laugh.
That's a great tip. What about, though, like, if you're in a situation where you tell a joke and it just, like, flops?
Oh, yeah, be prepared for that. Happens to everyone. And if it does, don't get flustered.
Yeah.
You can politely ask why it wasn't funny. Again, framing it as a learning opportunity.
Right.
I'm still learning about humor in this culture. Can you help me understand why that didn't work? It's all about being respectful and curious.
So, like, I guess the ultimate goal here is, like, really deep immersion, right?
Yeah.
Because the more you're surrounded by the language and the culture, the more intuitive your understanding of humor will become. And that includes all those subtle nuances, the things you can't really learn from a textbook.
Totally. There's no substitute for real-life interaction. That's where you get that immediate feedback and learn those unspoken rules of humor.
So I think what this deep dive has really shown is that understanding humor in another language, it's more than just, like, getting the joke.
Right.
It's about unlocking a deeper understanding of that culture's, like, heart. So for everyone listening out there, embrace that journey, embrace those awkward moments, embrace the joy of finally getting that punchline in a new way.
And maybe even consider this. How does a culture's humor reflect what they value most? And how can understanding those laughs give you a whole new perspective on their way of life?
That's a great point to end on. Thanks for being with us today for this deep dive.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.